I still remember the exact moment my boss looked me in the eyes and said, "We're letting you go." The conference room suddenly felt smaller, even though 6 people were sitting around the table. For 12 years, I had given that company everything I had. I had stayed late, fixed problems nobody else wanted to touch, trained people who eventually became my supervisors, and protected the company from mistakes that could have cost millions. Yet that morning, they dismissed me like I was an inconvenience. My name is Claire Morgan, and I had spent most of my career at Sterling Dynamics, a rapidly growing technology company that had started as a small office and turned into a multi-million-dollar business. When I joined, there were fewer than 20 employees. By the time I was fired, there were nearly 400. I had helped build the systems that kept the company running, but somewhere along the way, the executives decided that people like me were no longer important. They wanted younger employees, bigger personalities, and people who would agree with everything they said. The final blow came after our new vice president, Jason Reed, took over my department. Jason was 34, charming, ambitious, and completely uninterested in learning how the company actually worked. During his first month, he asked me to explain our internal operations. I spent 3 hours walking him through everything, including the systems I had personally designed. He smiled, thanked me, and then began presenting my work to senior executives as if he had created it himself. I could have confronted him, but I chose patience. I had learned something during 12 years at Sterling Dynamics. People who take credit for other people's work eventually make mistakes because they don't understand what they stole. Jason's first mistake came 6 weeks later. He pushed through a major software migration without following several safeguards I had built into the system. I warned him twice. He ignored me. When the migration failed, nearly half of our largest clients experienced service disruptions. Instead of admitting what happened, Jason blamed my department. Suddenly, executives who had praised me for years were questioning my judgment. I knew exactly what was happening. Jason was building a story where he was the brilliant new leader cleaning up an outdated department, and I was the stubborn employee standing in his way. Then came the meeting. Jason sat at the end of the conference table with our CEO, Martin Hale, and the head of human resources. There was a folder in front of them. I knew immediately what it meant. Martin avoided eye contact while Jason explained that the company was restructuring and my position was being eliminated. They offered me a severance package and asked me to sign a confidentiality agreement before leaving. I listened quietly. Then Jason leaned back and said, "You should look at this as an opportunity to start something new." I almost laughed. Instead, I picked up the folder, stood, and said, "Thank you for making this decision so easy." They expected anger. They expected tears. They expected me to beg. I gave them none of it. As I walked out of the building, I could feel people watching me through the glass walls. Some looked sympathetic. Others looked uncomfortable. A few probably thought I had failed. After all, Jason had won. He had removed the person who knew the company better than anyone else. What none of them knew was that I had been preparing for this possibility for months. Before Jason arrived, I had noticed something strange in our financial records. Several large contracts were being moved through a new vendor account that didn't make sense. The vendor had a different name, but the payment details were connected to a consulting company partially owned by Jason's brother. I quietly documented everything. Then I discovered something worse. The software migration Jason had forced through wasn't simply a bad decision. Certain security protocols had been deliberately disabled before the migration. The changes had been made using executive-level credentials. I couldn't prove who had done it, but I knew enough to understand that the failure might not have been accidental. I had backed up every relevant report, email, approval, and system log legally available to me through my role. I had also reported concerns through the proper internal channels. When nobody investigated, I stopped trying to convince them. Instead, I prepared for the possibility that I would become the scapegoat. The morning after my termination, I met with an attorney named Rebecca Lawson. I placed a thick folder on her desk and told her everything. She spent nearly an hour reviewing the documents without saying much. Finally, she looked at me and asked, "Claire, why didn't you use these before they fired you?" "Because I wanted to know how far they were willing to go." She closed the folder. "They went farther than I expected," she said. Over the next several weeks, I stayed completely silent. I didn't post angry messages online. I didn't contact former coworkers begging them to defend me. I didn't call Martin. I didn't even respond when Jason sent me a smug message saying he hoped I was enjoying my new chapter. I simply watched, and Sterling Dynamics began falling apart. First, 3 major clients canceled their contracts. Then an internal audit discovered irregular payments connected to the vendor I had identified. A few days later, the company's legal department received a formal inquiry from regulators. Jason suddenly stopped, answering my former coworkers' calls then. Martin called me. I stared at his name on my phone for almost a minute before answering. "Claire," he said, his voice completely different from the confident executive I remembered. "We need to talk. I don't work for Sterling anymore. I know. Then I'm not sure what there is to discuss." There was a long silence. Finally, he said, "We found problems in the migration." "I know." Another silence. "Did you know about them before you left?" I smiled. "Yes." His voice became tense. "Why didn't you tell us?" "I did." That sentence changed everything. Rebecca had already submitted the documentation showing that I had warned management before the migration. My reports contained timestamps, recipients, responses, and system records. The company had ignored every warning because admitting the problem would have threatened Jason's position. Now they had a much bigger problem. The investigation expanded. Jason was removed from his position. His brother's consulting company was investigated. Several executives were questioned. And suddenly, the same people who had watched me walk out of Sterling Dynamics like a defeated employee were trying to contact me, but I wasn't interested in going back. Instead, I did something they never expected. I launched my own consulting company. I used my severance money, savings, and years of experience to build a small firm specializing in corporate systems, internal controls, and technology risk. Within 3 months, one of Sterling Dynamics' former clients hired me. Then another did. Word spread quickly. The woman they had called outdated was suddenly advising companies on the exact problems Sterling Dynamics had ignored. 6 months after I was fired, I received an invitation to an industry conference. The keynote speaker was Martin Hale. During his speech, he talked about organizational accountability and the importance of experienced leadership. I nearly smiled when I heard it. After the presentation, Martin approached me. He looked exhausted. "You did very well for yourself," he said. "I did. We could have handled everything differently." "Yes," I replied. "You could have." He looked down. "Would you ever consider consulting for us?" I looked at him for a moment before answering. "No." His face fell. "Why?" "Because you didn't fire an employee who failed you. You fired the person who was warning you." I walked away before he could respond. A year later, Sterling Dynamics was sold to another company for a fraction of its previous valuation. Jason was no longer there. Several executives had left. The systems I had built were being replaced, and the company was struggling to rebuild the trust it had lost. Meanwhile, my company had grown to 18 employees. One afternoon, I stood in my new office looking through the glass wall at my team. Some of them were younger than I had been when I started at Sterling Dynamics. I thought about the woman who had walked out of that conference room carrying a cardboard box, wondering how everyone could look at her like she had lost. Then I realized something. I hadn't lost that day. I had been released. They thought firing me would erase my value. Instead, it gave me the freedom to prove that my value had never belonged to them, and that was the part they never saw coming.